Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Horror at the Hospital, Volume 3, Story 1. I worked in a Catholic teaching hospital, and the original building was built in the late 1800s. I had heard stories of patients seeing a faceless nun nurse wearing a habit during nightly rounds. I used to work in the medicine unit and would rotate to nights often. One night, a co-worker asked me to round on our patients together. For some reason, she did not want to go into this particular isolation room alone. Usually, with negative pressure rooms, we stay in the ante room and look in on the patient through the glass door to make sure they're okay. Apparently, the night before, she was rounding on her partner's patients when she saw a shadowy figure standing over the patient in the dark room. She didn't think much of it, as it was common for family to stay over in our unit. But it turns out, the patient had no family member with them that night. During night shifts, we're allowed a sleep break, and we have a covering partner. There's a cornered storage room where staff can put a few stretchers during break, and this place feels creepy even during the day. I don't use this particular area, but one night my usual place was occupied. So there I was lying down in one of the stretchers with other people that were on break as well. I don't usually sleep during these sleep breaks in case something happens to one of my patients, but I kept having dreams or visions of someone in scrubs walking back and forth beside the stretchers. At one point, I had my arm sticking out of the blanket when I felt something slowly clasp my hand and hold it. I simply changed position and yelled at it to go away in my head. And this is my last story. This happened at the geriatric rehab clinic I worked at. There's an activity corner for the patients located beside the staff office and is visible from the reception area. I walked in one morning and said hello to the front desk when I see this old lady with a neon pink top with her back turned, holding on to the grab bars along the wall. Strange, we never have patients this early. As I turned the corner and got to the office, the area was completely empty. I went out into the office and back out to chat with our clerical and mentioned the patient being so early. Our clerical was confused and told me no one had checked in yet. But who was it at the back when I said hello to you a few minutes ago? Needless to say, I gave her a scare really early in the morning. Next story. I used to work in an old labor and delivery unit. It was a small hospital, so oftentimes I was back there by myself. I like to keep the lights low and things quiet back there, so naturally I heard a lot of creeps and groans. There was the whole back hall unused. There was also no access to it except by passing me. I would hear metal objects clanging and doors shutting. It sounded like somebody was getting ready for a C-section. I could always sense something there. There was also a back room on the medical surgery floor that was never used. It was a patient room converted to a storage room. That room was strange. Call lights always going off and nobody near it. The whole hospital had a creepy aura. Maybe it was a cemetery next door, if that in itself is not strange enough. I worked in the MICU and we had some really sick patients there. I haven't actually seen a ghost, but my unit has ghost stories. From my experience, I've learned that when a patient tells you they're going to die, they usually do. And if they start talking to dead people, like as in family members, they usually die. It's like the family members have come to take them. Well, in bed 3, there was a homeless patient. His name was Willie, who thanks to modern medicine was kept alive for I believe around 3 months. There was no family to stop care. Willie eventually died, but patients who are in bed 3 will talk about their friend Willie, who brought them a blanket or stopped by to talk. Bed 3 is at the end of the unit and has an anteroom before you go in. You can't see directly into bed 3 unless you're in the anteroom or looking at the room on the monitor. One night, with no patient in bed 3, the monitor flipped to the room and a body was seen laying over the side of the bed, over the side rails, kind of floating. The room was checked and no one was there. Another night, a nurse who had worked in the unit a few years saw someone sitting in a chair behind the door in bed 3 with their legs crossed. She wondered, since we have limited visiting hours, how a family member got in the room. She went in the room and no one was there. Needless to say, she was freaked out. There was also another patient who was a young woman in her 20s who contracted necrotizing fasciitis from one of her kids who had strep. She was in the unit a while and eventually died. One of the nurses coming onto the next shift wanted to know why the patient was standing on the backside of the unit with her twin daughters holding their hands. Wondering how she made such miraculous recovery was what she wanted to know. She was informed the patient had died earlier that day. Next story. The weirdest thing happened to me one night when I was working night shift back in South Africa. I had a patient whom I thought was playing with his IV, causing me no end of headaches. As we have all had experiences of this type, I eventually confronted him after having to open the clamp for what seemed like the 100th time that night. He got really irate with me and said he had done no such thing, but blamed it on a young nurse in a white dress whom he said had fiddled repeatedly with it. I was confused, as while we wear specific uniforms in South Africa, they were not white at this specific hospital. Needless to say, I was really irritated, and I think we both ended the conversation feeling exasperated. I didn't think about the young nurse for several weeks until one night, in a totally different room with a totally different patient. The call light rang, and when I went to answer it, the patient said he had a problem with one of my staff. Curious, I asked what. He said a young nurse in a white uniform was standing quietly in the doorway of the dark bathroom, staring at him, and it was freaking him out. At this, my hair stood on end, but I reassured him that he must have been dreaming and checked the bathroom just to be sure. There was nothing there, but I will never forget it. Another instance, there was a patient who was terminally ill with liver cancer in a private room. I was working days, but the night shift people said they hated going into the room because something would blow on the back of their necks and shadows would move where shadows shouldn't be. The man was a Christian, as was his wife, and his wife said she saw this black presence descend above him and his breathing would become labored. She asked myself and a friend to pray for her, which we gladly did, being Christians ourselves. We anointed and blessed the room and prayed with the family and asked the Lord to seal the room. From that time on, the room was filled with peace and love, and the man breathed so much more easier. People had no more problems with going in there. This gentle little man eventually passed away, but it was in a place of peace and love. Next story. When I was a student working on a male medical ward one night with my mate, also a second-year student, the auxiliary and staff nurse both left the ward together for their break, leaving us two in charge. Suddenly, a man in one of the beds sat bolt upright and said, "Who are all those soldiers?" A guy in the bed opposite awoke and commented that he could not see their feet. My pal and I tried to calm them down, telling them it was probably the side effects of their tablets. When the staff returned, we told them the patients had seen something on the ward, but did not say what. The auxiliary then went pale and said it must be their anniversary again. She told us the hospital used to be a military hospital during the war, but the floor was 12 inches lower, and every year a troop of ghost soldiers walked down the ward with their feet on the original floor, so you never see their boots. Exit 2 student nurses. Next story. I worked in an LTC facility in night shift, and several years ago, when I was an aide, a gentleman had passed away. Not too long after that, we were having a severe thunderstorm one night, and a great big clap of thunder was heard. His lights started going off just as the thunder clapped. We all knew that it had to be the storm, but it still freaked us out that it was his room that the light rang. Now we have another room that we all think is haunted. During the day or night, this room's bathroom call light will go off. The two ladies that live in this room are not able to walk, so it's obviously not them. One night, the light in their room and in the bathroom had gone off several times. Someone finally mentioned it to the day shift, and they said it happens to them also. Just the other night, I turned off the bathroom light myself, and they were both snuggled in bed. I hurried up and got out of there after I shut the light off. The other strange thing that happened in this room is that one of the ladies likes to chant the number 6 over and over. One night, the aides had been in the room several times because the other lady had put on her call light. She had done this right before rounds, and when the aides went back in the room a short time later to check on them both again, the lady that had been putting on her light was completely turned around in bed. Her head was at the foot of the bed, and the covers were just as straight as could be. This lady could barely move, so it's interesting how she got herself turned all around in bed, and then not to disturb the covers. Another night, when I was working, a few weeks afterwards, we were having the same problem with the room with the light going off in the bathroom and the room itself. The aides were getting freaked out, which also got me giddy. I was in another part of the nursing home, and the aides came running up to me, all breathless, saying that so-and-so's bed was levitating off the ground. I told them I wasn't going in there, but since I was the one in charge, I had to put my anxiety away. We all went to the room and kind of peeked around the corner, and sure enough, the whole front of the bed was off the floor, the wheels and all. I walked in there and the headboard was hooked on the roommate's bedside table. When they had raised the bed up to check the residents and then started to lower it, it must have moved a little bit. So when they were putting the bed down, the headboard caught the table and all they could see was the bed staying where it was and the wheels raising up. We all had a good laugh over that. However, after that, the light stayed off in that room. Thank goodness. Next story. This happened a few years ago. I just started working at the hospital in town, so I didn't really know anybody from there. I did, however, work at an independent living assisted facility for almost 4 years, and in almost every department save for nursing and housekeeping. Anyway, a few years back, during the fall, I was working security. My general duties included answering phones, helping residents, making exterior rounds, shoveling snow. I swear, we had one of the snowiest winters that I can remember when I worked the position, and locking up the building at 11 p.m. On one such night, I'd just finished locking up the building. I let myself back into the office to record the temperatures from the coolers in the kitchen and such. As I'm writing, out of the corner of my eye, I see a man who I thought lived at the east end of the building. He doesn't move too quickly, but not really slow either. Needless to say, if I wanted to, I could have caught him going down either hall quite easily. As soon as I saw the man, I put down my pen and went right out into the hall. Nobody in the east end, nobody on the west end, and nobody on the mezzanine. The only way he could have gotten away is if he ran. That's how quickly I dropped my pen and investigated. I was eagerly anticipating the night janitor clocking on. In another occurrence, I had finished up rounds. I'd say it was about 11:45 p.m. I settled in with one of my textbooks at the front desk to study some material for my nursing theory lecture. I didn't see any movement out of the corner of my eyes, but I heard a distinct sound of one of those aluminum carts going over the tile. I didn't see any movement, but that noise was undeniably what I'd heard when somebody would push one of the carts around. The only tile in the whole building is right in front of the lobby and in the kitchen. Nobody was around again. I was eagerly anticipating the night janitor coming on so I could clock out and get the heck out of there. I'd heard some first-hand accounts from several of my friends from the kitchen where oddly enough I began and ended my employment. Anyway, we had a cook who pretty consistently came in hungover for the Saturday morning shift. This was a problem in and of itself, and it still does happen for several of our early morning cooks. Chucky would put the large mixing bowl for eggs or whatever on the large stainless steel counter and go back into the walk-in cooler to get whatever was necessary as far as ingredients. He would come back out and the bowl would be spinning down the counter. Several other cooks have told me how they'd be preparing stuff for lunch and dinner and various items for meals throughout the week. We have a large rack that holds all of our chafing dishes, lids, and on the side we hang all of our ladles. Well, one by one, the ladles came off. One of the cooks who loved me dearly gave me this advice. Should I encounter the spirit myself, I often worked early on the weekends, just put a cup of regular coffee out in the serving area and it will stop. Apparently there was a little old man who would throw things until the early morning cook or server would get him his coffee. It's a good thing to know that there are things you can do to quell odd goings-on. Next story. I was doing my final consolidation in a psych hospital, and most of the nurses on the floor had at least one story that led them to believe the floor we worked on was haunted. Once 2 nurses were on either end of the ward trying to close windows. They'd close one, go to the next, close it, and the first windows would open again by themselves. Finally, they both ran out of the rooms they were in, only to discover the other nurse doing the same thing. 2 nurses have had their hair flipped on when no one was around when they were sitting by themselves. One nurse felt something wet drip onto her hand when sitting. She looked up It was something red. She wiped it off. Then she looked up, nothing on the ceiling. Another nurse, that one that had the incident with the window and had her hair flipped, was doing rounds at the beginning of the shift. The shower room door was closed, but she heard the shower running. She went, asked co-workers who was in the shower. No one knew. Didn't think anyone was in the shower to begin with. So she went to the shower room, went to open the door. It was locked. She could still hear the shower going. She freaked a bit, thinking a patient had been locked in. Unlocked the door, opened it, and the shower stopped. The same nurse was sitting seclusion. She could hear the door handle of the locked solarium rattling, like someone was trying to open it. It's a lever type of handle. The sound of it going up and down over and over is unmistakable. In the morning, she went in there. She had opened the window of the staff smoking room in there to air it out, and she thought maybe the wind had done it. The window was closed when she checked, and no one had closed it. A few nights later, the same nurse and another one went to the solarium, passing by the male bathroom. No one was in there. All the patients were in bed. They got their smokes from the solarium. Not more than 10 or 15 seconds later, walked past the male bathroom again and heard the tap running. This nurse had earlier turned off the same tap, thinking someone had left it running. Now again, she's doing rounds. She heard someone whisper loudly, "Fire!" in her ear. Again, no one was around. Another night, another nurse was in a staff room alone and heard very distinct click, click coming from the bathroom. A few minutes later, what she told us, another nurse was testing out sounds, trying to figure out what it was. The nurse who heard it said it sounded more like the door handle going up and down. And after that point, I wouldn't have tried to find out what else it could be. Next story. The first place I worked at as an aide had been the county poorhouse for at least a couple hundred years of people living and dying there. The old home is now the Historical Society. It's open to the public. There is one building that has the name of the asylum. Our county disaster services agency has stuff stored there, and I belong to that unit. I hated going in there anywhere near dark because you could feel the confusion, the hate, anger, and even in the light, you can see shadows of things that aren't there. The new home was built and everything was moved down the road back in 1976. I started working there as an aide when I turned 18, and even though I've left there several times, I still work there as a restorative RN. When I first worked there, there was an LPN, grandfather from an aide, yes, they did that not so long ago, that had the best stories. Some of the things she said would curl your hair, but I always thought they were just that, stories. Boy, was I wrong. Even though the home was newly built and on farmland, all the residents, I think probably some of the energy moved with them. The weirdest things happened. One night I was working on one section and one of our residents died. A friend and I were cleaning him up to prepare him for the funeral home, and the light above the sink started turning itself off and on. Not only did the light turn off and on, but the switch moved. Man, I get out of that room as fast as I could. Another night I was on the other end, and we had 3 gentlemen in the ward that had lost their legs and minds to untreated syphilis. Now note, I said their minds were lost. A few rooms down, a woman that we were expecting to die did so. At the very minute, one of the men in the ward sat up, started talking perfect sense, asking some questions, and went back to sleep. Also, the couple across the hall had a clock radio that the alarm no longer worked in, but they always listened to the radio. That same time that alarm went off and stayed on till we went to check Olive and found that she had passed. Those were the mild stories. I don't know if I just wasn't sensitive then or if I ignored a lot, but it stayed mild like that. My grandmother lived in one of the old mansion homes in the area. She could also tell you tales that will curl your hair, but I always took it with a grain of salt. But I have to admit, you sensed a lot just being in the home. I went to work there as an RN charge nurse just before they built a new home on the same ground, and when it was done, they tore down the old mansion home. Well, believe me, those energies moved into the new building quicker than we could. Call lights turning off and on, lights, etc. Even keys locking themselves in locked rooms. The new home was equipped with surveillance cameras, and that's how we found the keys. Needless to say, I started believing my grandmother's stories. There was a man in the old home that died before I worked there and after my grandmother died, so I'd never seen or heard of him before. I would see him every night walking down the hall from his room, and when he'd cross the threshold to the dining room, would step very high as if there were a large step there. It was driving me nuts, so I finally asked some of the aides that had been there a long time and described him to them, and they said, "Oh, that's just Flicky. He always did that." I sometimes believe they stayed there because they had no others in their life. Most of them came from the state hospital that had closed, and the staff was really their only family. There were several of them that I could see doing a lot of things just as they had done in life, looking and acting the same manner. Was it just energy, or were we the only ones that were there from in life, so they stayed in death? Next story. Working the 3 to 11 shift in a nursing home, I was doing my med pass when I was summoned by a CNA to a room. Upon entering, the CNA states, "I think she just died while I was changing her." I checked for breathing, circulation, and the patient's orders. She was a DNR, do not resuscitate. I then attempted to get blood pressure, nothing. So I called to notify the patient's son, who requested for mom to be sent to the ER to be pronounced, and they would go straight to the hospital. I contacted 911, our protocol for transferring for pronounced, and summoned the ambulance. Approximately 20 minutes passed before the ambulance arrived. The paramedic and the EMT followed their protocol and followed the same steps I had, breathing, circulation, and BP, and got nothing. By the time they loaded my patient, covered her, and sent on the way to the hospital, 30 or 40 minutes passed. In transport to our local hospital, the ambulance had to cross a railroad track. When the ambulance crossed the tracks, the patient sat up, pulled the sheet from her head, and proceeded to point and shake her hand at the paramedic, screaming, "Take me back! Take me back right now! I mean it! Take me back right now!" The EMT driving pulled over to check out the commotion. The paramedic exited the ambulance and proceeded to vomit. The paramedic then continued to the hospital and phoned the nursing home to tell me what had happened. Approximately an hour later, the son phoned stating, "I was surprised to arrive at the ER and my mom greeted me. Did you perform CPR after talking to me? You know she was DNR, right?" When the family was told of this incident, they simply said, "It just wasn't her time." The only thing I can come up with even to this day is the bumps caused by the railroad crossing jolted her heart to start beating again. By the way, that paramedic resigned when his shift was over the next morning. Next story. I worked in several nursing homes since 1997, so I've had plenty of run-ins with restless spirits. At this one nursing home, there were 3 different wings, north, east, and west. West wing was the heavy hall, mostly tube feeders and total care. East was the Medicare short-term rehab wing. Then there was north. North had a pretty eclectic mix of patients of differing levels of acuity. There was a short hall and a long hall. However, to the back of north wing, there was a long hall that had about 10 private rooms, a day room on one end, and a small dining room on the other end. The residents back on this hall, called 400 Hall, were all ambulatory and even a few wanderers. Now, I generally worked from 3 to 11, but on this particular night, the 11 to 7 girl was sick, so I was asked to stay. As I was off the next night, I agreed. Since I was working a double, I was given the assignment on 400 Hall. It was an easy assignment, as most of the residents were continent, and the few that weren't were really lightweight. Anyhow, I was sitting in the dining room with the lights off, charting by the dim lights of the hallway, when I caught something out of the corner of my eye moving down the hall. Thinking it was one of my wanderers, I looked up and saw, to what this day I still believe, was a toddler on a tricycle. Let me tell you now, I lost it. The ADL book went flying and I skittered up the short hallway to the nurse's station. I relayed my story to the charge nurse, and she just sort of chuckled at my expression and explained that one of the residents that had passed away years ago had a grandson that was killed by the back tires of her car. He was in the driveway and she didn't see him and backed right over him. The night the lady died, she was calling out, "Tyler, oh my baby Tyler, Nana's coming." Then she passed. Everyone has come to the conclusion that the toddler on the tricycle still haunts that hall looking for his grandma. Either way, I never worked again, the 11-7 on the 400 Hall. Next story. I've never seen any ghosts or spirits, but I've had some uneasy feelings in 3 separate old places. One was the old Naval Hospital in Newport, Rhode Island. One was the nursing home wing of Long Beach VA Hospital, and one was the Cadaver Lab in one of the old vintage World War II buildings at Oak Knoll Naval Hospital. We used to have our classes in the classrooms adjacent to the Cadaver Lab, and we had to go up there at night to study. I always felt as if I was being watched when I was in there alone. It wasn't a peaceful feeling either. It was really creepy. Part of our duties in those days, this was in the 70s, was sprinkling those cadavers down with formalin once a week. I always have expected to look up one night and see one of them walking zombie-like down the hall towards me, like the zombies in Night of the Living Dead. There were only 2 girls and 5 guys in our class, and I always tried to get one of the guys to study with me at night. They felt the same sense of creepiness, but somehow it just felt safer with one of them there. Another creepy thing, my mom and I weren't particularly close, but I don't think we had any issues. She died after being comatose for several days after having an MI when she was just 47. I have had, since she died in 1981, scary dreams about her. In the dreams, she's a zombie coming at me with long, ugly fingernails, and she has fangs. Now, when I was about 9 or 10, I remembered my mom telling me to clean the bathroom. This was my Saturday chore. So one morning, I was arguing with her that I wanted to go and play with my friends. She called me an ingrate. I told her there was no such word. Next thing I know, she had grabbed me from behind by my ponytail, spun me around, and as she did, she raked her long, pointed fingernails, fashionable in the early 60s, across my face. I think it was purely an accident. She just wanted to spin me around and show me the word ingrate in the dictionary. Now, I had 5 bloody fingernail scratches on my face for days. But in those days, that wasn't unusual. I can remember kids coming to school with a palm print across their faces after being slapped for smarting off to their moms. My husband tells me I must obviously have unresolved issues with my mom, but I really don't. In fact, that incident never bothered me. My mom had a horrific childhood. Her earliest memory was coming home from kindergarten and finding her mom dead, kneeling on the floor, head in a gas oven, a la Sylvia Plath. And she and her brother and sisters were all sent to different orphanages because their father was a long-distance trucker and apparently couldn't or didn't want to take care of them anymore. So I just figured she had her own inner demons. She was never intentionally abusive to any of us, and no one ever would have considered that child abuse in the 60s anyway. In fact, I figured it served me right for smarting off to her. Next story. When I worked in a nursing home, we had a resident that was unpleasant to say the least. One day, I was on bell duty. It was my responsibility to answer all the bells for 2 hours, and the man rang his bell and told me that there was a black dog under his bed. I looked under the bed, but there was nothing there. I thought that he could have possibly seen a dog because it was a hot day and the front door to the home was open. I told him that the dog must have gone out of the door before I arrived. He rang the bell again a short time later, insisting that he could see a dog under the bed. Again, I couldn't see anything. This carried on. He became quite hysterical on one occasion, shouting that the black dog under his bed was trying to bite him and that it had red eyes. He looked terrified, and I couldn't calm him down for ages until the dog had disappeared. I handed over what happened to the nurse in charge and went home as it was the end of my shift. The next day, I was on the afternoon shift and found out that the man had died not long after I had gone home. It really freaked me out. He was a very unpleasant man, and I often wondered if the dog was there to take him away to you-know-where. It's one of those stories I've never forgotten. Next story. Actually, it's a story that happened to my best friend several years ago. About 14 years ago, her hubby worked for the Air Force, and they were stationed at Edwards Air Force Base, where the shuttle lands. Anyway, her mom had come out to visit, and they were driving off of the base pretty late at night. Well, according to her, at Edwards, in order to get off the base, you have to drive for miles and miles through the desert, and it is, of course, very dark at night. So they're driving through the desert. She and her mom and her son is in the back of the car when her headlights light up a guy walking on the side of the road way up ahead. He's got on a flight suit, and he's carrying his helmet in his hand down next to his body. When they're getting closer to him, her mom turned to her and suggested that maybe they should pick him up. My friend agreed, and when they both brought their eyes back to the road, he had vanished. She said it was the weirdest thing that had ever happened to her. They both just kind of looked at each other with shocked faces. The thing about Edwards Air Force Base is that they do a lot of test piloting for planes out there, and several planes have gone down in the desert, killing men over the years. And one has to wonder if that was one of them. Next story. I used to be an engineer maintenance man at a private hospital outside eastern New Orleans. Once, when I was on an evening shift, I was walking towards the PICU, and I was approaching the passenger elevators when an older woman and her preteen daughter of maybe 10 years old were getting off the elevator in somewhat of a hurry. She approached me and asked me if there were any accidents or incidents of possible violent death with anyone employed there. I had to think on it for a second, because I knew one story, but I wanted to know why she asked before I told her. She said her daughter saw a black male wearing a plaid shirt with jeans and work boots, but he appeared to be transparent. My mind instantly said, damn it, it can't be. She also informed me that her daughter had an unusual talent for seeing spirits. That's when I told her about Reggie, or Larry, the name has been disputed over the years, falling to his death down the elevator shaft while the hospital was under construction. I didn't know him, but several other people, including doctors, RNs, and fellow co-workers, have reported catching glimpses of him jumping into the elevator doors or hiding behind dark corners. The story creeped me out so much that no one had ever actually described him before. The only thing we knew was that he was a black man who died during construction. Also of note, he is famous for sending the elevator to the roof, which is only accessible by using a key. This happened to me personally a couple of times. I would always yell out, "Hey buddy, chill out," and the elevator would leave that floor on its own and take you to the basement level. Another one tells of the mysterious black shape moving through the day surgery unit and scaring the hell out of several housekeepers so bad that they wouldn't set foot in it to clean it out unless someone else was with them. I never experienced that one, but I do believe them.